in this spirit of conviviality, I hope I can also make a kind of riposte. You know, when I got this assignment months ago, I thought, oh yeah, sure, operative history, I can talk about that. You know, I thought operative was just another word for generative or projective or action, and yeah, I can talk about that because it has a lot of similarities and resonances with what in the discipline of history we call public history. So that is historians who are trained to work in museums, in national parks, in archives and libraries, and government agencies, and even in businesses who are doing history in public, who work in heritage organizations and things like this. And I do some of that myself. There's a real tension there, though, and I've experienced it personally. I'm on the board of trustees of the California Historical Society in San Francisco. That is very much part of just the everyday practices of how you see public history played out, and that's that within public history there's a real demand for what we would call heritage. And David Lowenthal, a historian, wrote a great book called The Heritage Crusades and the Spoils of History. And his argument was that history as practiced by historians within the discipline of history and public history will always have this tension that in public history there's a real demand for heritage, for stories that confirm, in a sense, people's stories about themselves, that validate them, that give them a place. And you know, of course, we've been through a generation and more of kind of questioning those dominant narratives. And in public history, but even within those kinds of questionings, of women's history and various ethnic histories and environmental histories, there's often, or histories of social movements in the practice of public history, there's still a kind of demand that those public histories be affirming, confirming that they, give agency and power, and so that's, that's still often in tension with the way that we practice as historians, being very critical about how those histories are constructed. And so while I like this, and I'm very interested in this tension between, what this idea of operative history, I still worry about that a lot. So, being a historian, when I figured out that operative history was like this thing, I realized I better figure out what it is and trace its geology. And I was leaving the, City Lab the other day and saying I was going in search of Manfredo Tafuri, and Dana looked at me alarmed, and said, be careful, there's lots of people who never come back. And I have just as a quick aside here, one of the things I went to look for was an oral history that was done with Tafuri and the Getty that is in our library in special collections at UCLA. And so I went to look at it, and unfortunately it was in Italian. And though I speak Spanish and Portuguese and French and read them, it wasn't enough for me but I recommend it as possibly a project. I mean, there might be a project there for a graduate student interested in this. I have no idea whether there's something kind of new and interesting in there, but it looked like really an interesting oral history that traced his whole career. And it's not that long, so it might be a really interesting project. My concern is though, just to kind of cut to the chase, that Tafuri's argument, against operative history, that he called, this analysis of architecture that involved the planning of a precise poetical tendency derived from historical analyses, programmatically distorted and finalized, that's something that we should really still be concerned about. I think that the critique of operative criticism still obtains, and so I continue to be kind of worried about our embrace of this term as one of our methods, and maybe I'm being far too particular about it. I'll tell you a little bit about my own conception of history, because I think it might be helpful, and sometimes I think I'm a bit of an oddball in my own discipline, so that you do know where I come from. I see in a lot of what I read as I got into this. I began particularly with Sarah's writing and the aggregate folks and others to recognize more and more of my own ways of thinking about this. That when I teach history and teach it to engineers or ecologists or people who are going to go on to law school, very few of whom, of course, are going to end up being historians, the things that I want them to go away with are really, whether I'm teaching a course called something like, a course I've taught called Climate Change in California, History of the Future, which is essentially, though, a kind of excuse to teach students about how to think about things like structure, reproduction, contingency, agency, the things that I see, in what Sarah's talking about, what the aggregate group is talking about, and to and use a very simple kind of metaphor for students. Think of this room, as the structure within a structure of a university. It doesn't really mean that much without you all, coming into it and reproducing the symposium, the classroom, our interactions. That there are contingent events. Take a dramatic example. If there were an earthquake, and that each of you have agency in the choices that you make, and that's what I want students to come away with. Is whatever they go into is how to think historically. I also very much a presentist, which in my discipline is a sin. But I'm presentist in the sense that I really believe that we do history for the present and the future, and that's what really matters. Not in the sense of I do believe that the past is a foreign country, and we go there, and people do things differently there, and we go there to understand the range of human possibilities. Many of those things that didn't lead to who we are, but as we become attuned to those possibilities, some of which can be recovered, some of which can't, and here I will turn to some of these images. They attune us to the possibilities around us today, and that those possibilities must be paid attention to. And I think that's one of the, if you will, the uses of history for me. These images are in the current issue of Boom, the journal that I edit. They're made by the San Francisco Estuary Institute. This represents the landscape on the left, the landscape in California before colonization, and the landscape today. And give you several of these. And the San Francisco Estuary Institute has what I think has developed I've worked with them a lot and talked with them a lot. They've developed a more and more sophisticated argument over the years, that these images are not meant to convey in any way a past that we should go back to. You can't rewind the tape of history, but that you can see that there are there are structures that continue to be evident in the landscape. But there may be some possibilities that can be recovered. But again, that they suggest also possibilities of ways of going forward and not going back. When I was, one other kind of point about my own practice of history, I was remembering earlier today when I went and talked to one of my dissertation committee and was, as a historian at Stanford University, I was in the humanities, and here at UCLA, I'm in the social sciences, I see history as really a magpie discipline that uses a lot of methods from a lot of different fields. We continue to borrow from those. And I went and talked with one of my committee and was talking about some of the findings of my own research, which have to do with data and mapping and space. And she was saying, in history, we don't have findings, we have readings. I'm a little bit concerned as I've learned more and more about the history of urban planning and architecture and the role of history in that as I think about the urban humanities and as I think about bringing together the historical, critical, what we've sort of conceptualized as the historical and critical fields and the material and speculative or generative disciplines. That we're kind of ignoring the fact that for the last 30 or 40 years, these supposedly material and speculative disciplines have actually become more and more critical. And that there's a kind of crisis even, as I read it, a crisis even within urban planning and architecture about that move. And if what we do in the urban humanities is actually just to bring in kind of more critical from the humanities, I think we've blown the opportunity that we have. So I want to make another toast to some alternatives to operative history, and these all amazingly come from Sarah Whiting herself, which pardon me, the promiscuous proliferation of terms that is, in Sarah's own writings, which is wonderfully provocative and inspiring. So I began to think, if we don't want to call it operative history, what about tactical history, or projective history, or intervention history, or generative, or public, or even one that I really like, Doppler history, taken after the Doppler effect and derived from a wonderful essay of Sarah's. Or perhaps even better, Robert Mitchum history, in contrast to where Sarah contrasts Robert Mitchum, the cool projective actor, in contrast to Robert. Well, we might also want to think about Robert De Niro history, the critical, sort of the actor who really makes the work apparent and evident in his acting. I want to end by saying something more about these images And so whenever the San Francisco Estuary Institute gets up and talks about these images, my good friend Robin Grossinger, who directs this historical ecology work, and these maps, by the way, are all derived from like information from diaries and photographs and old maps and diseños of the ranchos. You know, this is the end result of very, very thick mapping. And they you know, they'll do these reports, very scientific reports, and despite, you know, kind of despite, they have the line that I, you know, told you earlier, and they say, you know, we're the scientists. These maps are not meant to tell you what to do or what can be done. They're information that we can use, that can become part of the debate, part of planning. And I say, with John Pickles and others, that, you know, every map is a proposition and an argument, and that there is a proposition about the possibilities of the landscape and the possibilities of the future in these maps. And that it has tremendous power and value. But I also recognize that in taking that stance and saying that this is research, this is objective research that has followed some methods, that has standards of evidence, that has error bars around every single piece of information in this thick map, and you can go back and you can trace the sources, and you can evaluate it. And then saying, this is the science, there's the value decisions that need to be made in the public arena around planning of particular projects, around restoration projects. This map has had even more power. And these maps have played a great role in restoration projects and planning projects in such arenas as the Delta, the Sacramento, and the San Joaquin, and the future of that. And so this makes me, you know, come to the end and think that one of the things as we begin to think about interventions and how we use these different methods, to maybe introduce another term. And I think, as you can tell, I'm not settled on what this term should be. I might even be willing to continue with operative history. I'm thinking about strategic history, and that, you know, using these mixed methods, using them in a way that is strategic, that thinks about the interventions that we want to make, that thinks about the audiences for the research and analysis, but also for the arguments for intervention, that is critical and generative. And I don't want us to lose sight of the big picture and the big challenge here. And for what I know, it's, you know, these are figures that everybody knows, but I think it's important to keep in mind that in the next 40 or 50 years, the urban population on the planet is going to double. As we've heard, that means the urban built environment is going to double. How that takes place is fundamentally going to shape how people on Earth live with nature and live with each other. And just as an aside, I mean, you know, thinking about Anastasia's talk, much of that is going to be what we call informal. And, you know, we have a really great opportunity and a great responsibility here, I think. And I want to make a final toast, a final proposition, and that's go big, or go small, or go home.